Good morning, everyone. Good morning. How are we doing today?
Good morning, sir. Fine, thanks. How are you?
I overworked and underpaid. So I'm sure that you can all sympathize. Um, so let's start by checking in. How do you guys feel about occupiers' liability so far?
A little iffy, but reviewing notes, I understanding a little better.
Okay, that's good. That's good. Shasia, were you
I
about
was
to
just
say?
saying, I think I need to review it by myself. I need to get something to review it to get it.
Okay. Anybody else? What are the things that are, is there anything that's still unclear that you're ready to discuss?
Could you recap the difference between contractual visitors and licensees under
Well,
common law?
yeah. So the common law says that the licensee is owed a duty of care, and that duty of care is to warn of any hidden dangers. Right. So you don't owe much of a duty to a licensee. It's if there are hidden dangers, you have to warn about them. The contractual visitor is actually owed a warranty of a reasonably safe premise, right? When you bring on the carpenter to fix your staircase, right? That carpenter can be confident that they're not going to fall uh, into a black water pit and drown in your sewage, right? Whereas a licensee absolutely only can be confident that if there's an open black water pit, that you will warn them about it. So do you see the difference?
Yeah, somewhat. Because you said with the licensee, you should warn them there's an open. But if the licensee falls in, whereas the contractor, like the licensee wouldn't, like the person wouldn't be more liable for the licensee.
So the liability might be present in both cases, right? The licensee is owed if the pit is hidden and there's no warning, right? And then the licensee falls in and drowns. That would still be a problem for the occupier. Um, the contractual invitee, the contractor, um, can be confident that there is no pit. If there is, then you as the occupier have a duty not just to warn but to protect them from the pit, right? Fence it off, mark it off, prevent them from tripping and falling in.
Okay, I understand.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay. All right. Anybody else have questions about Erica says, so a warning would be enough to prevent liability for the invitee. So invitees are owed a different duty of care, right? The licensee, there's a duty to warn of hidden dangers. The invitee is owed a different duty, and rather than mistake that, let me give you the actual statement. The invitee is owed a duty for the occupier to be reasonably aware of unusual dangers and to prevent harm from them. So what's the difference between the invitee and the licensee, right? The difference is that the invitee is owed a duty for the occupier to seek out unusual dangers and make sure that they are resolved. Whereas the licensee is only owed the duty to be warned of things that the occupier already knows about. So do we see the difference? Erica, you asked the question. So do you see the difference?
Sir, I'm struggling to see the difference between why the owner, the occupier will be liable more so to the invitee rather than the licensee.
Well, because the invitee is the person for whom the premises are held open for a purpose, right? There's a reason the invitee is there for the benefit of the occupier, whereas the licensee is there for their own benefit or not really for anyone's benefit, right? So does that make sense as to why there's a difference between the two?
A bit.
Okay. Let me see if I can explain it a little differently to maybe make this
Sorry,
make
I
more sense.
understand what you're saying with the licensee being permitted on the premises just to solely entertain the occupier, and then the invitee is there to do business or whatever, like shopping or
Yep.
etc.
That's exactly right. That's
So
exactly
you're
right.
saying that the liability will be more.
You've gone quiet, Erica.
I follow it, sir.
Okay. All right. So for example, right, the licensee is the person who comes on to your premises with no purpose to benefit you. Okay, so for example, right, when I have my neighbors over for dinner, that they are a licensee, and my duty to them is to warn them of the tiger pit in my backyard, right? If when I bring the neighbors over to sell them the homemade pickles that I've made that I'm selling out of my kitchen, they are now an invitee, and I owe them the duty to seek out opportunities for harm and to protect them from it. So I have a duty at that point to prevent them from going into the backyard where the tiger pit is. So does that help, Mystique?
So I'm thinking if you invite someone to your home, right? You're saying that that person would be a licensee?
If they're there just for a social purpose, right? There's no economic benefit for us, right?
Oh, okay.
We have to keep in mind that this doctrine really comes out of the relationship between a shopkeeper, right, and or an innkeeper, even more specifically, and their customers. And so there are people who come into the inn yard or into the inn who are not there to do business with the innkeeper. They're there because they know them and they're there to socialize. And those people are owed a lower duty of care than the folks who come in to drink beer or be served food, right? So does that maybe make the doctrine make a little more sense? Because the common law doctrine, I agree, the distinction between licensees and invitees seems very fine grained. This is part of why the statute does away with the distinction altogether, right? Is that these legislatures in London, in Kingston, in Bridgetown, right? The legislatures have decided that we don't think this is a reasonable distinction anymore, we're going to eliminate it. Okay? Shasya, your hand is raised. Go ahead.
Yes, sir. In an exam, would you talk about both the common law and the legislation, or you pick a territory? What would
I
you
think
do?
the answer to that is going to depend on what the question calls for. So very frequently the question will be, will be grounded in some sort of jurisdiction. And if that's the case, you should use the appropriate rule for the jurisdiction. If the question is tied to, is sort of asking open-ended, and just saying, what's the rule on this, whatever, right? Then you would want to go down both paths to obtain full marks. Yeah, that's sort of the best answer that I have, is that you should be able to determine from the call of the question what is being asked for. And I guess I would say that and this is not a criticism. You haven't done anything wrong. So let me preface by saying this, but these kinds of questions feel very much like trying to game the system. And that is one thing that I really do find somewhat distasteful.
When
I
you say game the system, what do you
that
mean?
that it's not that what's happening is, when I get those kinds of questions, what it feels like is sometimes it feels like students are saying, what is the bare minimum that I need to do to reach whatever threshold of success I want to reach in the class? And the answer, right, the truest possible answer is you have to know everything. And trying to discern, do I need to know this? Do I need to know that? The answer is you need to know everything. If we have covered it in this class, it is fair game.
I understand. I just
and
want to know how.
yeah, and anyway, yeah. So okay, good. Any other questions about occupier's liability? All right, so let's take it away. Let's talk about this week's activity. And that is, excuse me. That is that we want to write a fact pattern that in your mind would fail each of the 3 questions in the remoteness analysis. So I know that we are in a busy time of the semester with guild elections, with other courses having various assessments. So while I hoped that you guys would have this, have an opportunity to look at this, if you need a few minutes to gather your thoughts and write write the fact pattern, then we can do that. So do you guys need the think part, or have you had a chance to do this on your own time?
I would maybe time now to prepare.
Okay.
I haven't prepared beforehand.
Okay, well, let's take a few minutes then and get that done. And since it sounds like a few folks have prepared and maybe some have not, we're going to be fairly brief on this, and then we will break into the pair portion. Okay, so I'm going to mute now, but if you need anything, just pop in and say something. I will still be here. All right, so here's your Okay, so now you've all had a chance to put this together. We're going to step out into breakout rooms of, there's 15 of you. We will do groups of 3. And remember that this is about like not just getting a grasp on your partner's work, but also making it better. So be sure to inquire of one another how you, how you fail each step of the remoteness analysis. So keep that in mind. Okay. So with that, I'm going to.
I have a question.
Yes, go ahead, Joy.
With respect to this analysis, it's not a scenario. I understand the purpose of this exercise, but it's not a scenario where, if you fail the first step, you don't need to proceed to the others.
That is absolutely true. If you wrote 3 fact patterns, right, one that failed at each step, that's fine. Or you can write 1 fact pattern that fails all 3 steps, and we can sort of go, okay, yes, it fails step 1, but let's assume that it passes. How does it fail step 2? Right? So do you see?
Okay.
Right? We don't, because we're not doing this in the context of an actual judgment, we can analyze things that the court would say we can dispose of this. We don't have to answer this question.
Okay, because that was kind of my follow-up. Like if we were, presented with a fact pattern to do an analysis, I could stop after you failure at step 1.
You are absolutely correct that if you are tasked with writing a judgment, right, if that's the call of the exam question, then failing on step 1 means that you do not have to analyze steps 2 and 3. However, if you're writing a brief, okay, what if the court disagrees with you that it fails step 1, and then you've waived your argument on steps 2 and 3?
For the others, right? Okay.
So, all right. With that, we're going to go into the breakout rooms and take a few minutes to talk amongst yourselves, and then we will reconvene and you will present one another's work. Again, the last piece of this is share, but you share someone else's work, not your own. All right? So the breakout rooms are open. Please head on in. Bernice, are you okay? Hello? Okay, so we're back, and I'm gonna throw a random number generator in the air and call upon a group. But within the group, whoever wants to go first can go first. So group three, that's Barry, Rajay, and Sierra. Who would like to present someone's work? Barry, you came off mute, so you have been volunteered.
This is unbelievable. All right. Okay, so a little boy received a phone for Christmas, a cell phone, of course, and while using it, it exploded. Would he have expected it to cause damage? No. Was it reasonably foreseeable? No. So we've concluded that the scenarios failed all the possible criterias.
Was the damage?
Was
Oh,
the type of harm reasonably foreseeable?
No, the type of harm was not reasonably foreseeable.
Well, I mean,
because-
I'm not sure that I agree with that because, you know, us granting for the sake of argument that cell phones explode, we would expect that to be harm to the person, right? And absent any sort of, you know, since you didn't specify, I would assume that the exploding cell phone caused him some sort of physical injury. So I think that the third step may be, you know, if we accept that the first two hurdles have been passed, that the third step is a problem, right? That maybe we didn't fail the third step.
Okay.
I agree with you that the first step presents an interesting puzzle here, right? Is a cell phone a reasonably foreseeable source of danger? I tend to agree that, you know, maybe not, right? Certainly not in the sense of, is it going to blow up in your hand? You know, if we had written the case fact so that, you know, the child threw it at someone, maybe that changes the analysis, you know, because at that point it's just a very fancy and expensive rock. But I think that is an interesting, I think that's an interesting way to approach this. So I have a private question. Is the foreseeable test somewhat subjective? Yes and no. So it is objective given the circumstances. So it's what would a reasonable person do under these circumstances as they were perceived, which means that you do have to ask, what does the tortfeasor know? What does the tortfeasor perceive? And that piece of it is subjective, right? The tortfeasor is not sort of the panopticon prison guard who sees everything. There are limits to their perception. Does that answer your question? The person who sent me that question, does that help? Okay, good. All right. So Barry, did you have something else you wanted to say? Go ahead.
No, since you've mentioned those factors, it makes perfect sense how we could have come to perhaps a more firmer conclusion. What I would ask is, in a scenario like that, would there be a set of parameters like on this? I mean, nobody think when they buy a cell phone actually reads how to charge it. They just charge it. So like, would it have on the fine print? Do not use this phone while charging, or there's a possibility that the phone could explode while charging. Would that be actually on the fine print? Because come on, who really reads fine print in charging a cell phone?
I mean, that is possible, right? You know, we certainly have the iTunes terms and conditions. I mean, they could bury in those terms and conditions that I was agreeing to give Apple my firstborn child, and I would have no clue that I had agreed to it because I just scroll right on by. So I think that some of those questions are appropriate for Ms. Hamilton in your contracts class. You in that, right, these kinds of shrink wrap or click wrap cases present interesting questions of offer and acceptance, right? And so there's some puzzles there related to the formation of a contract. Related to the question of the foreseeability issue, right? That raises the question of there's some products liability issues, and there may be a duty to warn. And is the warning effective if it's buried in the fine print, right? We talked about warnings yesterday in lecture. So I don't have a great answer for you. The best answer that I have is maybe. Another private question, what about if the phone was charging, exploded, and burnt down the residence of the little boy? So this, I think, gets at the third question in the remoteness analysis, right? The question of, is the type of harm foreseeable? So do we think that exploding phones are likely to damage property? What do we think?
No.
I mean, I think the term exploding sort of carries the answer with it.
So you say yes, sir?
I would say yes. I would say that an explosion can be expected to damage property. It's more surprising if something explodes and it doesn't damage property. But so I think that, and the truth is that the third piece of this remoteness analysis, the type of harm analysis, is really much more relevant for claims for pure economic loss, right? So most of the time, if the damage you're dealing with is harm to person or harm to property, probably going to have reasonably foreseeable damage. The issue is going to be when you have the economic loss. Sierra, your hand was up quite a while ago and then it went down.
Right.
So why don't you go ahead, and then Renice,
Right.
you can jump
Speaking
in.
about the explosion, but you're looking at a phone which is just probably 1 pound in size, exploding an entire house, which is, I don't think that's foreseeable. That's extreme. I mean, if the little boy got burnt from the explosion, I can understand that, but not the house. And
I mean, I guess the question would be, what size of an explosion would you expect from a 1 pound battery and circuit board? That presents an interesting, that is a conundrum. I think you're right that there's room to argue there, right? I think that's right. Renice, go ahead.
So I was thinking why somebody would have said yes to your question about foreseeability and the explosion is the term foreseeability, because if you're gonna ask me generally, would you think that a phone will blow up a house? My answer would be no. But then if you think about it again, you might change to yes, because you're gonna say, well, it's an explosion, so more than likely it may blow up. It may cause damage, but like just straight off the top of your head, you're gonna be like, a phone can't really damage property,
Right.
depending on its size, especially. So I think for me, the confusion would lie on the term foreseeability in some instance.
So this I think is a really important point that you've raised here, because the question is not, is it reasonably foreseeable that an exploding phone would burn down a house? The question is it reasonably foreseeable that an exploding phone would damage property? Okay. An exploding phone, sitting on a stack of books, probably going to damage the books, right? That would be damage to property. And there's a number of cases, if you go back to the remoteness worksheet, if you go back to the remoteness section in the textbooks, there's a number of cases where the court says, look, you don't get to turn off reasonable foreseeability because the damage was greater than you expected. As long as it's of the type that can be expected, you're on the hook. So, so I think that, you know, the important piece of this is that we're not just asking, is the damage that occurred reasonably foreseeable? That's not the question. The question is, was the damage that occurred of a type that was reasonably foreseeable? Okay. So does this help? Does that maybe make that third question make more sense now? Yes, no, maybe? Okay. We are almost out of time. So rather than rush through another presentation, what I will say is if anybody wants, you know, same deal as we've done in the past, if you want to email me your fact pattern, I will send you back a couple of sentences of feedback. Not terribly extensive, but a little bit. If you don't have to. But that is an option that is available to you. What questions do you guys have about today's activity before we wrap things up?
Sir, I felt like the question to me was sort of, I don't want to use the term distracting, but it was like a reverse psychology kind of question.
Yep. This is an exercise
me in a sense.
Yeah. So this is an exercise in boundary drawing, right? This is an exercise in figuring out where the limits of a doctrine are. And I think it's a useful exercise, but it is definitely like it's a puzzle. So I understand if you found it confusing, you don't have to worry about it. You're not, you know, you guys don't, I want to be clear about this. You guys don't get assessed based on what, you know, on our tutorial activities. These are for you to grapple with the concepts, and for me, you know, what I'm doing is I'm trying to see where the things that are troublesome for you guys, okay, so that I can calibrate on my end. So it's okay that this was difficult. That's perfectly fine. That's perfectly normal. You don't have to worry about that in terms of your performance in the class. A quick example of a fact pattern that would fail the remoteness test. Sure. So our plaintiff has been served cucumber sandwiches at a tea party. They ate one. The seeds of the cucumber lodged in their esophagus and sprouted. And then they had a cucumber plant growing in their esophagus, and they choked and died. You know, the medical science was baffled by this. So let's start with the first step, right? Is a cucumber sandwich a reasonably foreseeable source of danger? Probably not, right? Is the story that I have told you a manner of harm that is reasonably foreseeable? No, right? And third, is the type of harm that occurred reasonably foreseeable? Absolutely. So this fact pattern, as I've given it to you, does not clear the third hurdle. However, if we change it and say, okay, instead of suing the person who served the cucumber sandwich, right, our plaintiff's estate is suing the physician who failed to figure out that this was what they were presenting with. And they are now, and they're suing for the lost wages caused by the 20 years of working life, right? So now it's economic loss, right? And is that type of damage foreseeable? Okay. If you think this is extreme, that's because it's intended to be. I mean it when I say this is an exercise in boundary drawing. Okay. The remoteness hurdles are not especially difficult to clear. Writing a scenario that fails them means that you are on the fringes of human behavior. Okay. So, all right. So we are out of time. And I have another tutorial in 10 minutes. So I can't hold over, but I appreciate you guys putting the effort in. This was really helpful. Again, email me if you want feedback on your fact pattern. Mystique, your hand is raised. You get the last word.
Okay, so this isn't my usual tutorial. My usual tutorial is supposed to be at 12, well 10 past 12, but I just decided to come to an earlier one, just informing you.
How dare you? As you can tell, I am not especially concerned about it. You know, I do prefer that folks stay in the tutorial that they're enrolled in or let me know what they're doing. But as you can see, it's not something that I'm going to throw a temper tantrum over. Okay. But so thanks for letting me know, but don't worry about it. All right. So with that, I'm going to let you guys go. So I will see you guys next week. So take care and bye.